The data obelisk shattered against Kalen's palm. Not broken, not cracked. Shattered, the way you shatter something to make a point, not because you have to. The silver casing crumpled like paper in his grip, and the light inside it, that soft Terran frequency light that Lyra had always found oddly warm, went out. Kalen held the pieces above the speaker platform at Zenith Station and let them fall. The Terran delegation stood below him. Their diplomat, Alara Vance, watched the fragments hit the floor. She did not look at them. She looked at Kalen. Her expression was something Lyra could not name, because no expression in Vesperan emotional vocabulary covered what Alara Vance's face was doing in that moment. It wasn't rage. It wasn't grief. It was something colder and more patient than either. "Pray," Kalen announced to the assembled hall. "The Terrans are classified. Pray. Stay close to what I'm about to tell you." What came after that word, I wish I could say it was simple. 3 weeks before the hall fell quiet, the water recycler on Lyra's assigned quarterdeck at Zenith Station had developed a slow drip that maintenance kept promising to fix. That detail has no strategic relevance whatsoever. She thought about it often in the weeks that followed, because it was the last ordinary problem she could remember having. The Drakari delegation had arrived with credentials and a fleet. The credentials were courteous. The fleet was 38 ships and was not. Lyra had watched from the Vesperan Observer Gallery as Kalen's representatives occupied the station's communications nodes one by one, quietly, the way you change a lock before the tenant notices. The Drakari did not conquer Zenith Station. They simply made it inconvenient to leave and then impossible, and then they stopped explaining the difference. Lyra had been a trade attaché before all of this. Low clearance. No military training. Her most significant professional achievement had been negotiating favorable import duties on Vesperan grain composites, which felt, in the current context, like a credential from a different universe. She was not supposed to be the one who mattered. The memory crystal had come to her 3 days before Kalen's address, pressed into her hand by an older Drakari administrative officer named. She never learned his full designation. He had given her the chip, looked at her for exactly 2 seconds with flat, exhausted eyes, and walked back into a corridor that Lyra never saw him exit. She had been about to report it to station security when the Drakari locked the security office. She held onto it. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment. Mostly she was terrified. The chip was warm against her palm during Kalen's entire address. She could feel it the whole time he was speaking. She was watching Alara Vance's face when the data obelisk fragments hit the floor. She saw Alara's eyes track from the debris to Kalen's hand, to the Drakari fleet positions visible through the observation port, then back to the debris. All of it in under 4 seconds. Alara's jaw did not tighten. Her shoulders did not shift. Whatever calculation she was running, she ran it without letting any of it reach her face. That was the first time Lyra understood that the Terrans were different. Not in a way she could have explained then to anyone who asked. Just a certainty, arriving without warning the way certainty sometimes does. Alara Vance turned and walked out of the hall. Within the hour, a tight beam transmission left Zenith Station on a frequency the Drakari had not yet thought to block. Lyra pressed the memory crystal tighter against her palm and waited. The war did not begin the way wars are supposed to begin. There was no declaration beyond the one Kalen had already made by opening his hand and letting the fragments fall. The Terrans did not wait for another. Within 6 days of Alara Vance's transmission reaching Terra Prime, Kira Sterling had seeded the Obsidian Narrows with stealth mines so precisely calibrated to Drakari hull harmonics that 3 supply convoys passed through safely before the 4th did not. Then the 5th. Then the 6th. The Drakari sent engineers to sweep the corridor. The engineers found nothing because the mines were tuned to ignore Vesperan mass signatures, a detail that told Lyra someone on the Terran side had studied their allies' ships at least as carefully as their enemies. She filed that observation away. She had no one to file it with. Her trade attaché credentials meant nothing now, and her reputation as a careful, cautious Vesperan bureaucrat, the kind who documented everything and alarmed no one, felt like something that had belonged to a previous version of herself. That version had not been carrying classified Drakari military intelligence in her palm for 3 weeks. At Ethelgard, the Drakari ground forces advanced expecting open terrain. What they found were tunnels, and Terran soldiers who moved through them like the tunnels had been built specifically for this purpose. They had not been. The Terrans had mapped them in 72 hours and turned geography into a trap. Lyra heard this secondhand, from a Drakari logistics officer whose secondary respiratory membranes had swollen tight against his throat casing. An involuntary stress response she had never seen reach that severity, and who kept repeating the word impossible in a register that suggested he was no longer using it as hyperbole. Which meant the tunnels had worked better than even the Terrans expected. Here was what Lyra understood, watching from the margins of a war she had no training to interpret. Terran adaptability was not a strategy they deployed. It was a condition. They did not decide to adapt. They simply could not stop. Put them in a corridor full of mines and they mapped the harmonics. Put them underground and they learned the dark. The Drakari had spent centuries classifying species by their fixed capabilities. They had no category for a species whose capabilities changed depending on what you put in front of them. That was the first fragment of understanding. It did not make her feel safer. The orbital strike on Ceres outpost arrived without warning. She was reviewing grain composite import figures. She did not know why. Some part of her brain had decided that normal work was a viable response to an ongoing war, and she had let it. The alert came through a borrowed data terminal and she read the casualty numbers and sat with them for a long time, and the grain composite figures were still open on the screen behind the numbers, and for some reason that was the detail that stayed with her afterward. Not the numbers. The grain figures still open underneath. Alara Vance's broadcast went out 4 hours later. Not to Terra Prime. To everyone. Every frequency, every diplomatic channel, every open civilian band across 14 systems. Lyra heard it through a wall vent because the Drakari had locked her quarterdeck's terminals again. Alara's voice was not angry. It was precise and it was patient and it described, in specific and unrepeatable detail, exactly what the Drakari had done and exactly what the Terrans intended to do about it. It was not a threat. Threats imply uncertainty about the outcome. Lyra walked to the end of her corridor, and she pressed the memory crystal into the hand of a Terran logistics runner she had never spoken to before, and she said, "This needs to reach Alara Vance. I don't know your protocols. I don't know if this is the right thing. But the man who gave it to me walked back into a corridor and didn't come out, and I've been holding it for 23 days, and I think it was always supposed to go to her." The runner looked at the chip, looked at Lyra, said nothing and left. Lyra stood in the corridor for a while after that. The second fragment settled into place. Small species pressured long enough do not stay small. The Vesperans had stayed small. She was not certain anymore that she had been right to call that caution. The Valkyrie interceptors hit the Drakari fleet's primary attack formation at Apex Nexus from 3 vectors simultaneously, using approach corridors that should not have existed according to any standard tactical model corridors that existed because the memory crystal's intelligence had shown exactly where the Drakari fleet sensor arrays had a 17-second stagger on rotating sweep. 17 seconds. Kira Sterling had built an entire engagement plan around 17 seconds. The Drakari fleet did not collapse. It unraveled, which is different and worse. Each ship that lost formation tried to compensate, and each compensation created a new gap, and the Valkyrie interceptors were already there, in the gap, moving. Lyra watched the battle feed from a borrowed terminal with Drakari text overlays she could only partially read, and she understood enough. The third fragment arrived, and it was this. The Terrans had not won because they were stronger. They had won because every time the Drakari expected a fixed response, the Terrans gave them a different one. The Drakari had armor. The Terrans had kept changing the question. Kaler signed the peace agreement in a room at Zenith Station that had not been cleaned since the occupation began. The ink on the document was a Terran compound. The Drakari had no equivalent. Kaler's bioluminescent identification strips, the ones embedded along his forearm, mandatory for all Drakari command rank officers, pulsed an irregular amber sequence for the entire signing ceremony. Not the signal for anger. Not the signal for grief. The sequence Lyra recognized from old Vesperan xenobiology texts as the one that meant, "I no longer understand the situation I am in." The occupied planets were released. The Drakari forces withdrew. The thing they had built was quietly dismantled. At Zenith Station, in the hall where the fragments had fallen, the delegations assembled again. Every species. The Sylph, the Vesperans, the minor trading coalitions whose names Lyra had once memorized for import duty purposes. The Terrans. And at the center of the speaker platform where Kalen had stood, there was a new data obelisk. Silver-cased. Intact. Its interior light was on, that soft Terran frequency light, warm in a way Lyra had never been able to explain and had stopped trying to. Elara Vance did not look at it the way a person looks at something they are proud of. She looked at it the way a person looks at something that needs to work. She sat down. Everyone sat down. The light stayed on,